The traditional approach is interested in the author's biography, among other things, and this approach is very appropriate for most of Fitzgerald's work. If you note his life, there are a number of things that he has in common with Charlie, including an alcohol problem and including a custody issue with his daughter. So that's a good topic of study if you want to look into Fitzgerald's life. This becomes a very important cultural artifact. The 1920s are reflected very clearly and appropriately and very well in Fitzgerald in general. This story takes place after the crash, so in the 30s. The Jazz Age was a time that actually Fitzgerald named for the time before the stock market crash, when everything seemed so golden. He was one of a number of writers who lived in Europe, American writers who lived in Europe, and like Charlie was very successful, at least for a time. We learn in this story also about the stock market crash and how it treated some of the Americans in Europe. Charlie, of course, in Babylon Revisited, has come back from his losses, but we know that he lost way more than money during this time. Another thing we might want to think about with this story is the treatment of alcoholism at the time of the setting of the story. At that time, I believe it was a very common practice for treatment to include having a drink a day. So when we see Charlie having a drink a day, we might be shocked and say, well, he's not serious about quitting. But actually, at the time, that was a common recommendation of the doctors, to have that drink a day. Charlie's obviously very important in this story, and I think that we very much like him and respect him in many ways for what he's been able to do. However, we also have to keep in mind that the point of view is limited third person. So we're getting his point of view. We're getting his thoughts. And I always ask people to think about how different the story would be if Marion, the sister-in-law, was telling it. There's a lot of symbolism in this story as well. Of course, Paris becomes a symbol of his past, and the name of the daughter becomes important. Of course, she's important in the story because he wants her back. She also becomes symbolic of his honor, and so the name Honoria becomes appropriate as well in that way. When I mentioned that the treatment of alcoholism is good to know because we don't blame him as much for that one drink, I still think that one drink is very important as a symbol. Because it is that link to his past, it becomes a symbol that perhaps he's not quite ready to give up that past and move into his future. The title, of course, is also symbolic. The city of Babylon was a city supposedly that fell because of great decadence, and so when he comes back to Paris, that's his Babylon. The mythological critics would be interested in the themes of this story that have to do with the past, present, and future. We have symbols here too. Honoria is a symbol of his future, where Duncan and Lorraine are symbols of his past, and of course during the story they keep colliding, and the past ends up keeping Charlie from the future that he wants. But the theme has to do with the ironic notion that the past is completely irretrievable. You can't do anything about it, and yet it keeps affecting our lives, as we find out with Charlie in this story. One of the literary questions about this story is whether it is a tragedy or whether it's pathos. And we're not just talking about the regular use of tragedy, meaning something bad happened. In the case of literary tragedy, we're talking about a fall of a hero that happens because of some fault, mistake, or flaw in the hero himself. If the fall of the character happens because of something beyond his control, then we would call it pathos. And one can look at this story either way. If you see it as a story where the world won't forget or forgive Charlie, then I suppose it's pathos. But there's an awful lot of evidence that it's tragedy, that this fall during this story, not before the story, but his inability to get his daughter back is his own fault. Because if you look carefully at the beginning, you see that Charlie gives his brother-in-law's address to Duncan Schafer, and that's how Duncan and Lorraine knew later where to find Charlie, and that's the point at which Marion decides that she's not going to give Honoria back. And so, very literally, he made the mistake that led to his downfall at the end. I still think, however, that we are to see this ending as hopeful, because going back to the symbolism of that one drink, when he doesn't take it, when we assume he really wants it, I think that is a symbol that maybe next time his break with the past will be complete and he'll be able to move ahead with his daughter.